the first and second and third ages of neoconservatism. It's got everything from heroes to adversaries, keywords, campaigns. It's actually a superb chart. That alone is worth the price of this book. But if I understand neoconservatism at all, it was an intellectual movement that began in around 1965, really, with the foundation of the Public Interest magazine. And I think what made neoconservatism distinctive was its skepticism about ideology in general. It combined in a very interesting way liberal sympathies with skeptical conservative sensibilities. And I think that it was the spirit of the Public Interest magazine, certainly a magazine that I admired very much. The reason I would argue that neoconservatism, at least as anyone understood it when it began, no longer exists, is because I think starting around somewhere in the late 1980s, neoconservatism really split into two movements. I think one part of neoconservatism stayed with or drifted back toward the Democratic Party, and that many of the people who had been called neoconservatives as dissenting liberals remained liberals. The names that come to mind: Daniel Bell, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Nat Glazer, who can't easily be classified, Mark Lilla, who also can't easily be classified to some degree, Marty Lipset. The other wing of the movement became straight-out conservatives. I think, in fact, the transition from Irving Kristol to Bill Kristol is an interesting case in point, where, except for Bill's brief time as a precinct a volunteer for Scoop Jackson, abandoned the Democratic Party fairly quickly, abandoned liberalism, and moved into straight-out conservatism. I do not mean this in any hostile way. I just think it's a description of reality. Bill did work in the first Bush administration for Dan Quayle, and his sympathies were clearly conservative. He will tell you the story of how he voted in 1984, or at least I hope you do. And I think that because we view neoconservatism now so much through the prism of the Iraq War and foreign policy concerns, we forget that this split, as I see it, I think began not around foreign policy issues, but around domestic issues. And I think the rise of supply-side economics is very important, and Justin does talk about this in the book. That some neocons, particularly Irving Kristol, were very taken by supply-side economics. They saw it as the answer to liberalism's skill at giving benefits to people. Irving Kristol invented the great theory of the two Santa Clauses, and that the liberals had the Santa Claus that gave people things through government, and so conservatives could be a Santa Claus who gave people things through tax cuts. And Judah Wanniski, the founder of, one of the founders of supply-side economics, found one of his most important homes in the Public Interest magazine. And so you had a whole group of other people who were neoconservatives who were basically absorbed in the larger conservative movement. And it's hard now, I think they are a distinct tendency perhaps, but they are really simply part of the larger conservative movement. I think my one bit of evidence on behalf of this thesis is that sadly several years ago the Public Interest magazine died, and it has been replaced by a new magazine, which is a very interesting magazine called National Affairs. But I think it is unquestionable. The new magazine is unquestionably a conservative magazine in a way that the old Public Interest on the whole was not. I think a second big transition is, in this transition I'm talking about, is that the law of unintended consequences, which to me was one of the great lessons of neoconservatism, is now no longer central to the neoconservative idea. Indeed, I was arguing with Bill about the Iraq War before the war started, and I said, one thing I learned from you neoconservatives is the law of unintended consequences. And my greatest fear about this war is that it will have more unintended than intended consequences. Just a couple of famous quotations on this. Dan Bell, one of the earliest editors of the Public Interest, wrote years before the magazine was founded, for the radical intelligentsia, the old ideologies have lost their truth and their power to persuade. few serious minds believe any longer that once they are set down, blueprints and social engineering can bring about a new utopia of social harmony. That was not a critique of the Iraq policy. Or Jay Forrester's idea that, quotes, in complicated situations, efforts to improve things often tend to make them worse, sometimes much worse, on occasion calamitous. I think the new neoconservatism, or what's followed neoconservatism, does not, on the whole, follow those warnings. Indeed, I think it's skeptical of some of those warnings. It is a movement that sees much more possibility out of government action, particularly if it's engaged in other countries. Two other points I want to make. Justin argues correctly that when one can take a movement like neoconservatism and use it as a prism to view many parts of our history. And this book does a wonderful job of that in so many places, and he has some very interesting and useful accounts of all the fights inside the Democratic Party. And at the end of the book, he makes a wonderful point, I think, where he says that in some ways it's not clear whether you should view neoconservatism as more part of the history of liberalism or more part of the history of conservatism. But I do think it's a mistake to view too much of our history through the neoconservative prism. For example, I think there's a tendency to assert that Cold War liberals, anti-communist liberals, tended to become neoconservatives. In fact, many Cold War liberals remain liberals. Many Cold War liberals actually opposed the Vietnam War, two of the most prominent being Reinhold Niebuhr and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And G. McCarthy, the great anti-war, one of the two great anti-war candidates in 1968, was clearly no leftist. Many who opposed George McGovern in 1972 did not become neoconservative. They remained liberals and Democrats, most notably Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, Ed Muskie. Indeed, many who supported McGovern were not McGovernites. McGovern himself, by the way, says he was not a McGovernite as it came to be described. You know, the great McGovern line, he said, "I wanted to run for president in the worst way, and I did." One notable McGovernite who was not a McGovernite was Bill Clinton, the founder of one of the key figures in the Democratic Leadership Council. And so I think that it's hard now to distinguish between neoconservatives and any other kind of conservatives. The Weekly Standard, Bill's magazine, is important not because it provides conservatism with a distinctly neo voice, but because it finds itself right in the middle of the Republican conservative Fox News consensus. Its positions now overlap substantially with those of the National Review, something that could not be said so easily of the old public interest. And I think that the current neoconservatism, and Justin, in focusing so much on foreign policy in the book, I think underscores this, in particular does not have a distinctive domestic policy. David Brooks and Bill took a stab at it with national greatness conservatism, but I think over time there really was not any a particular domestic policy attached to national greatness conservatism. But David Brooks keeps trying, and I think David Brooks may be the last existing real neoconservative. Having said that, individuals who carry the label will remain important voices. Neoconservatism is fascinating, but I believe a bygone intellectual movement. And I just want to close by quoting the founding statement of the Public Interest magazine, not the whole thing, you'll be happy to know, because I think it says something very important that we can all still bear in mind. For it is the nature of ideology, its editors wrote, to preconceive reality. And exactly such preconceptions are the worst hindrances to knowing what one is talking about. I think that's a great warning. I think those of us who are neo-proto, whatever kind of liberals should take it to heart. I think current-day neoconservatives would do very well to go back to that original essay and read it again about 5 or 6 times. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel, this very distinguished panel. And I really like Justin. I'm going to say Justin instead of Justin. You'll bear with me. Yeah, but we're in America now, so. Yeah. But he really has written an extraordinarily good history. This is a temptation, I think, that both in our blurbs, both EJ and I fell for, is to compare him to previous French observers of the United States. I would not say Tocqueville, because it's very hard to meet that standard. I would also not say Bernard-Henri Lévy, because that's too low a standard. But in fact, there has been a tradition of quite good French writing on contemporary American politics. The book I'd point to is the one by Alain Frachon and Daniel Vernet that was actually published at the time of the Iraq War. Justin's book is much more comprehensive. I mean, he's a serious historian. The other two are basically journalists. And so he's filled in a lot of the gaps and documented in a much more systematic way the history of this movement. And there's a number of reasons why I like it a lot. As Justin said himself, he's made very clear that there is no party line in this movement, and I think he's really paid attention to the complexity of the ideas that have underlined it. One of the early lines of defense of many neoconservatives when they were attacked was to claim that there was no such thing as neoconservatism, and by that I simply think it meant that there were really quite a lot of different ideas feeding this movement, and I think Justin's account of the three different ages is roughly right, and the kind of generational changes that were involved in moving from one to the other. And it makes, I think, very clear that this interpretation that neoconservatism was something like this alien spore that came from Mars and settled on the fertile plains of the United States and then took over the minds of these wholesome Americans is just not right, because in fact most of the tenets of neoconservatism are actually very old ones in the American tradition and in American foreign policy. I just think that the way that they were put together, particularly in the 2000s, was in a way quite unique, but every single one of them had deep roots. Justin mentioned these 5 pillars: internationalism, primacy, militarism, democracy, unilateralism. I think that's, I think you could actually collapse the primacy and militarism into a single pillar. But I think if you look further back at the history of the movement, there's another important pillar that was there right from the beginning and was the essence of the Public Interest magazine, which is what EJ had just alluded to, which was a great skepticism about the prospects for very ambitious social engineering. In addition to the examples that he gave, I'll just cite 2 of the classic books that came out of that. One was James Q. Wilson's Thinking About Crime, in which he explicitly says, and this was in the midst of the great crime wave that began in the mid-1960s, and when he wrote that book, finally in the 1980s, he said, look, anybody that thinks that you can deal with crime by getting at root causes like poverty and racism doesn't understand the limits of public policy. What you can do is ameliorate some of the symptoms and manage the problem, but you cannot deal with root causes. One of his ways of managing it was this famous broken windows article that he published with George Kelling in The Atlantic that actually, it's a article that I've greatly admired as an academic. I wish, I could write something that would have a comparable good effect on the lives of other people, because that's really what, in a sense, laid the basis for the kinds of policing policies that were then carried out after the late 1980s in New York and really led to the renaissance of that city. The other great example, of course, was Charles Murray and the whole argument about in Falling Behind about AFDC and the impact of that particular social program on out-of-wedlock childbearing, which ultimately led to the repeal of that law in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, which ended the modern American welfare system that Bill Clinton signed and passed by a